The bakery on Crestlow's Eastern Lane opened before the sun did. That was the whole point. Sandra Mills had chosen that shift 3 years ago and never let anyone take it from her. Pre-dawn meant the town was still soft. People who were half asleep did not look closely at the woman kneading dough behind the counter. They did not study her face, or wonder where she came from, or try to remember if they had seen her before. They just took their bread, left their coins, and walked back out into the dark. Sandra had built her entire life in Crestlow around that kind of forgetting. She was good at it now. Good at being the woman who smelled like flour and answered when spoken to, and kept her curtains drawn and her past buried so deep that even she had to work to find it sometimes. She pressed her palms flat against the wooden counter and worked the dough the way Winnie had taught her. Steady push, quarter turn, fold, repeat. There was a rhythm to it. She liked rhythms. Rhythms did not ask questions. She was 0 for 3 this particular morning. The flour order had come in short. The left rack of the oven was running hot again, and she had already rescued 1 tray of rolls from the edge of burning. And the man sitting at the corner table near the window, the one who had been nursing the same cup of tea for going on 40 minutes, was watching her with the slow, patient attention of someone who had been looking for a very long time, and had finally stopped. Sandra did not look at him directly. She had learned not to do that years ago. Looking directly at someone who was watching you told them they had been noticed. She watched him in the reflection of the dark window instead, in the thin glass and shadow version of the room that existed just behind the real one. His name at the counter had been something ordinary. Winnie had written it down and already forgotten it, because Winnie trusted everyone and forgot faces by afternoon, which was one of the many reasons Sandra loved her. He did not look like one of the palace's trackers. He looked like a traveling merchant with tired eyes and boots that had seen too much mud. That was exactly why she knew he was. She had learned that the hard way, too. Don't run. The thought was quiet, practiced, the same thing she told herself every time the cold feeling moved through her chest. Running draws attention. Running is how they know. She kept her hands moving. Push, quarter turn, fold. Her eyes moved carefully to the back door, propped open 2 inches for the heat from the oven. The alley behind the mill, the old Finch road that turned to mud past the river crossing. Horses hated that road. It was the only reason she had chosen Crestlow at all. She had just settled on her exit. Calm walk to the back, shawl from the hook, nothing that looked like leaving, when the front door opened. The little bell above it rang, and every careful calculation she had built in the last 3 minutes dissolved like sugar dropped in warm water. Because the man in the doorway was not a tracker. He was not anyone she had prepared herself for. Arthur Dermin stood in the entrance of a small-town bakery in a coat that had seen weather and hard roads, and his dark hair longer than she remembered, his jaw unshaved. He was broad-shouldered and hollow-eyed, and he looked, she thought wildly, from behind the armor of 3 years, like a man who had not slept properly in a very long time. His eyes found her in under a second. They always had. He did not say her name out loud. He did not need to. She read it in the shape of his mouth, in the way the air between them pulled taut like a rope being tested, in the low, quiet hum that moved through the bond she had spent 3 years learning to silence. It was not silent anymore. It had not stopped being alive. Not once. Not for a single day. She had only learned to breathe shallowly inside it, the way you learn to breathe in a room where the air has gone thin. She set the bread knife down slowly. The way you set something down when you are deciding, very carefully, whether or not to pick it back up. And she met his eyes across the warm, flower-dusted room. You should not have come here. The thought was steady, almost convincing. The look on his face said something she was not ready to hear. It said, "I know. I came anyway." The memory came the way memories always did, through the body first. The smell of wood smoke from the oven caught her somewhere behind the ribs and pulled her backward without asking permission, the way strong smells always do, and suddenly she was not standing in Winnie's bakery anymore. She was standing in the Palace Records room at the age of 19, with ink on her fingers and 3 unsorted ledgers stacked beside her elbow. And Arthur Dermin was walking through the door for the 3rd time that week, with no official reason to be there. She had not looked up that time either. She had kept her eyes on the numbers in the ledger and listened to his footsteps cross the stone floor, and told herself, very firmly, that whatever this was, it was not going to become anything she couldn't manage. She had been wrong about that. Sandra had come to the Palace of Aldenmere at 19 as a junior record keeper for the Eastern Trade Office. She had come from Crestlow, from a small house on the lane behind the mill, where her mother made candles, and her father drove a supply cart twice a week into the next town. She had no family name worth mentioning in palace circles. She had no connections. She had quick hands, a clean eye for numbers, and the ability to sit still for 6 hours without fidgeting, which was rarer than anyone in the records office liked to admit. She was unremarkable, and she preferred it that way. Alpha King Arthur Dermin noticed her during a routine inspection of the trade records in her 3rd month at the palace. Not because she was the most beautiful woman in the room, though she was not plain. He noticed her because she was the only person in the room who did not stop working when he walked in. Everyone else paused, pens lifted, heads turned, the small, instinctive interruption of normal people in the presence of power. Sandra kept writing. She finished the line she was on, turned the page, began the next column, and only then looked up to acknowledge the inspection, because that was the correct thing to do when the inspection reached her desk. She saw his expression for only a moment before she looked back down at her work. He looked surprised, and then he looked something else, something she didn't have a word for at the time. He came back 2 days later on a pretext so thin she could see through it. He came back the day after that with a thinner one. By the 4th visit, she had stopped pretending not to notice. The bond declared itself 6 weeks later. It happened at a council dinner where Sandra was taking minutes, a low, warm hum that moved through her chest without warning and made her hand go still over her notepad. She looked up. Across the long, crowded table, Arthur had gone equally still with a wine cup halfway to his mouth. Their eyes met over the heads of 12 council members who were still talking and noticed nothing, and neither of them said anything about it that night. She finished taking the minutes. He finished the dinner, and the hum stayed, warm and patient, like something that had decided to wait. The 2 years that followed were tender and complicated, and built entirely in the margins. Arthur was a king before he was anything else. Sandra understood that from the beginning, and built her love around it, the way you build a house around an existing tree, working with the shape of things, not against them. She learned to love him in the hours that were left over after everything else. Quiet evenings in the records room after the other clerks had gone. Conversations that started about ledger discrepancies and ended about childhood and fear and what it meant to carry something important without letting it crush you. He used to say her name like it had weight to it, like the syllables were something he wanted to hold carefully. She had stored that away. She stored everything that might be taken from her. The night of the marking, she was in her palace quarters. She had been reading. A dull report on Eastern grain yields, because her mind needed something to occupy it when it got too quiet, and the quiet kept slipping toward things she couldn't afford to sit with. The fire was low. The room was warm. Outside the window, the palace grounds were dark and still. The cold came without any warning. It moved through the half-formed bond like ice water poured from the inside, a tearing sensation, directional and specific, that she felt in the left side of her chest above her ribs. She knew what it was before she had fully processed that it was happening. She had heard enough talk in the palace about bonding, about marking, about what it felt like to a paired mate. She had asked once, very quietly, what it felt like from a distance. The healer, she had asked, had said it felt like a seam being ripped from the wrong direction. That was exactly right. Sandra sat on the edge of her bed. She pressed her hands flat against her knees. She counted her breaths, the way her mother had taught her when she was small and afraid of the dark. 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out. She sat there for 4 minutes. Then she stood up. She packed only what she could carry, a travel sack, warm clothes, the small amount of coin she had saved. She left the ledgers stacked on her desk in the order she would have left them for a normal morning. She walked out of the palace through the servants' gate in the eastern wall, or the one that was watched but not heavily, the one that a woman with a travel sack at a late hour could pass through with a quiet word about a family matter. She didn't cry until she was past the Finch Road bridge. After that, there was no one to see her. The roads she walked after that were long and cold, and several of them were unnamed. She used different names in different towns. Nothing dramatic, nothing that felt like lying, just the small adjustments that let a woman move without leaving a trail. She took what work she could find. She did not stay in one place long enough to become memorable. She had chosen Crestlow because of the mud on the Finch Road that horses hated. She had chosen the bakery because Winnie Doolin asked no questions and paid honestly and had a bad hip that made the early morning shift genuinely difficult. And Sandra had walked in at the right moment and offered to take it. That had been 3 years ago. She had built a life here that was just large enough to breathe in. And now Arthur Dermin was standing in the doorway of it. She was still behind the counter. Her hands were still resting on the dough. The flour on her palms had gone cool. She noticed, in the strange, sharp clarity of a moment that was too big to process all at once, 3 specific things about how he looked. He had not dressed like a king to come here. No formal coat, no palace insignia, nothing that announced what he was. He had travelled like a man, not like a crown. His hands, she had always noticed his hands, were rougher than she remembered. Like someone who had been doing the kind of work kings didn't usually do. And the expression on his face, which she had spent 3 years being certain she would never see again, was completely unguarded in a way she had seen from him perhaps twice in 2 years of knowing him. She was not going to run this time. The thought formed in her body before her mind had made any decision. She felt it in her feet, planted on the bakery floor. She felt it in the way she set the bread knife down instead of reaching for it. Not because she wasn't afraid. She was afraid. She had been afraid for 3 years, and it had kept her alive, and she was not foolish enough to dismiss it. But she was so tired. She was so tired of calculating exits, so tired of watching doors, so tired of the word that rose in her throat every time something good was placed in front of her. Careful, careful, careful. The bond hummed, warm and traitorous and annoyingly steady. She looked at Arthur Dermin across the room that smelled like cinnamon and yeast, and 3 years of the life she had built without him. She did not move toward him. But she did not move away. Winnie had left on an errand. She did not need to run. That was the thing about Winnie. She read a room the way some people read weather. She had looked at the man in the doorway, looked at Sandra behind the counter, looked back at the man, and then picked up her shawl and said she needed to check on the flower delivery, which was not due until Thursday. The man in the corner with the patient eyes, the one who was not a merchant, had also disappeared without being dismissed, which told Sandra everything she needed to know about how long this visit had been planned. She poured 2 cups of tea because her hands needed something to do, or she set one on the end of the counter closest to Arthur, and kept the other in her own hands, and looked at him with the same expression she used when she found a discrepancy in a ledger. Attentive, patient, not interested in pretending the error wasn't there. "How did you find me?" she said. She said it quietly, not as an accusation, as a question that required a real answer. Arthur came to the counter. He did not try to close the distance between them beyond that. He stopped at the far end and wrapped both hands around the cup she had set out, and she noticed that small choice. He was giving her the room. "A man named Harlan Cross has been looking for 8 months, he said. "The 4 before him found dead ends. I followed his last lead myself." "Why yourself?" "Because I didn't trust anyone else with what came after finding you." Sandra looked into her cup. The bakery was quiet around them. Outside, Crestlow was beginning to wake. She could hear the first cartwheels on the lane, the distant sound of a shutter being opened. Ordinary morning sounds, the sounds of a life she had built to be ordinary on purpose. She thought about what it meant that he had come himself, that he had not sent another official letter, that he was standing here in a road-worn coat in a pre-dawn bakery in a border town without a single member of his court. She filed it away and did not let it show on her face. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She came around the counter and took the chair across from him, and the table between them felt both like a practical distance and a deliberate one. For a long moment she did not say anything. She had spent 3 years composing and discarding what she would say if this moment ever came, and she had never settled on a version that felt right, so she said the true thing instead. "The night I felt it, I was in my rooms. I was reading. The fire was low." She kept her voice level, the way she kept her hands level when she had a difficult job to do. "I knew what it was immediately. I've heard enough descriptions to recognize it. And I sat there on the edge of my bed for 4 minutes. I counted. And then I stood up and I left." Arthur's hands tightened slightly around the cup. He did not speak. "I didn't take much. I didn't leave a note because I didn't know what I would say in it. I walked out through the eastern gate and I didn't look back. A pause. I didn't cry until the bridge." The words landed in the quiet between them and stayed there. She looked at him then, directly, for the first time since he had walked through the door. His eyes were exactly as she remembered them, dark, careful, and right now doing the thing they sometimes did, where they held more than his face showed. "I'm not asking for anything," she said. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself, or apologize, or make it make sense. I'm just telling you what it cost me. Because I walked out of that palace, and I kept walking for 3 years, and I built this." She gestured, a small motion that took in the bakery, the lane outside, all of Crestlow, and it took everything I had. So, I need you to know that. Oh, before anything else. The silence that followed was not the absence of something. It was its own kind of full. Arthur looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I know, and I have something I need you to see." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and set something on the table between them. A bundle of letters, tied with plain cord. Not thick, not thin. Just letters, stacked and bound, the handwriting on the top envelope unmistakably his. "I wrote to you," he said. "Every month for 2 years and a half. I thought—" a breath. "I thought you were choosing not to answer." Sandra looked at the letters. She did not touch them. "What you felt that night was real," Arthur said. "The sensation was real. What it meant, that is not what you think it was. I cannot explain all of it today. I don't have all of it yet. But the marking was not what you believe it was. And the woman's name, the name I need you to hear, is Lorena Voss." The name meant nothing to her. And then it meant something, because she remembered it from the palace, the Voss family, Eastern trade alliances, a name that appeared in ledgers connected to political arrangements. Something cold and specific moved through her chest. Not grief this time. Something harder than grief. The beginning of a different feeling that she didn't have a name for yet. She looked up from the letters. She looked at his face. Then she did the thing she had promised herself she would not do. The thing she had spent 3 years building armor against. She believed him. Not fully. Not yet. But enough to want to know what came after. "I need you to leave," she said. "Not forever. For today. I can't think with you in the room, and I need to think." He nodded. No argument. No negotiation. He stood and pushed in his chair with the same care he had always used with everything, and walked toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "The letters," he said, without turning. "I didn't know they weren't reaching you. That much. I need you to know that much, right now." Then he was gone. Sandra sat alone at the small table in the bakery that smelled like cinnamon and yeast, and the ordinary life she had built. She looked at the letters for a very long time. She did not touch them. Not yet. She counted them before she opened the first one. 31. They were upstairs, in her rooms above the bakery, spread across the small wooden table by the window, where she did her reading in the evenings. Winnie had come back an hour after Arthur left, and looked at Sandra's face, and not asked a single question, which was the most loving thing she had done in 3 years of quietly loving things. She had made 2 cups of something warm, and sat down across the table, and kept Sandra company, while Sandra stared at a bundle of letters, and thought about who she was now, versus who she had been the last time she had read anything written in that handwriting. "You don't have to tell me anything," Winnie said. "I know. But if you want to, I'm not going anywhere." Sandra looked at the fire. He came himself. Not a messenger, not a tracker. Himself. In a coat that looked like it had been on the road for weeks. Winnie was quiet for a moment. "That's a lot of road for a king." "Yes. What do you want to do?" Sandra didn't answer that. Not yet. Oh, she picked up the first letter instead. The opening was careful, formal even, the handwriting of a man who was not certain how to begin something and was using correctness as a placeholder for honesty. He asked after her health. He said he understood if she needed distance. He said the records office had hired a replacement, but that no one had put anything back in the order she had left it. That last detail undid something small in her chest. Not much. A stitch. Not a seam. She put it down and opened the 4th. The formality had cracked a little by the 4th. She could feel the effort of maintaining it, like watching someone carry something heavier than they were letting on. He said he had asked Healer Doolin to look into the bond. He said Doolin had found something unusual that he wanted to discuss with her. He said he was still looking. The seventh letter had no formal opening at all. It started mid-thought, like he had sat down with the pen already moving. You would have hated the council session on Thursday. Marmon Turlough gave a 40-minute speech about Eastern trade stability, and I thought of you the entire time because you once told me that a man who says something in 40 minutes that could have been said in 4 is a man who is afraid of silence. He is. You were right. Sandra set the letter down. She picked it back up. I don't know where you are. I have been telling myself that is by your choice, and I need to respect it. But there are nights when that is very difficult to believe, and I don't have anyone I can say that to. She read all 31. It took a long time. Motwinnie refilled her cup twice, and at some point put a blanket over her own lap and simply sat. The fire crackled low between them. Outside, Crestlow went fully dark, and then slowly, quietly quiet. The letters changed as they went, formal to fractured, to something raw and specific, the voice of a man who had been talking to the silence for so long that the silence had become the only listener he trusted. He wrote about things that had never come up in 2 years of stolen evenings in the records room. His brother Clyde, who made him laugh harder than anyone and worried about him in the loud, direct way that Arthur himself never managed. The palace in winter, which he had always found empty. A particular morning in the records room, before everything, when she had been trying to unstick a jammed desk drawer and had said something so precise and dry under her breath that he had almost laughed out loud and ruined the whole pretense of being there for official reasons. She did not remember saying whatever it was. She was glad he remembered it for her. The last letter was the shortest. I don't know if you're safe. I don't know if you're warm. I hope you found somewhere that feels like enough. I hope, if nothing else, that you are not cold. Sandra set it down and did not pick it up again. Winnie said nothing. She was the wisest person Sandra had ever known in the specific way of people who understand that some moments are not improved by words. After a long time, Sandra said, "He mentioned someone, Marmon Turlough, his senior advisor. The man who talked for 40 minutes? Yes. He mentioned him in 3 different letters. Always neutral. Always right when Arthur was about to do something different about the search. Always closing a door somehow. Gently." Winnie tilted her head. "You think this Turlough person—" "I think," Sandra said carefully, "that I am a record keeper by training, and I know what a pattern in documents looks like, and I know what a closed door looks like when it's been closed from the outside." She looked at the pile of 31 letters on the table. "I spent 3 years inside a story I built from one night's evidence. I need to know if the story was real." Winnie nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she had already figured something out and was waiting for the other person to catch up. "So what do you do next?" Sandra looked at the fire. "I go back to the inn," she said. And I ask him to tell me about Lorena Voss." The inn at the edge of Crestlow was small and clean, and had the particular warmth of a place that had been occupied by the same family for 3 generations. Arthur was staying in the room at the top of the stairs. Sandra noted, when she arrived that morning, that he had no court attendants, no palace guard stationed in the hall, no insignia visible on anything. He had come to Crestlow as a man, not as a crown, and she stood in the corridor for a moment and turned that over in her mind before she knocked. He opened the door immediately. She did not know whether he had been awake or whether he had somehow felt her approaching through the bond. Both possibilities seemed equally likely, and she chose not to ask. She walked in, took the chair by the window without being invited to sit, and looked at him. "Tell me about Lorena Voss," she said. Everything. He told her. The Voss family controlled the eastern trade routes, a long-established family with deep financial interests in the northern realm's most critical supply lines. 2 years before Sandra had left the palace, those routes had been the subject of a growing political crisis. The Voss patriarch had been threatening to redirect trade through a competing alliance unless certain political agreements were formalized with the crown. Turlow, his senior advisor, had presented a solution. A political marking, ceremonial, temporary, a blood seal rather than a true bond, performed between Arthur and Lorena Voss. It would satisfy the Voss family's demand for a formal crown alliance without creating an actual permanent bond. The blood seal, according to the palace's bond specialists, produced the visible effects of a marking without the permanent spiritual connection. It was designed to be indistinguishable from the real thing at a distance. At a distance. Through a bond. Sandra was quiet for a long moment. You agreed to it. I agreed to what I was told it was. A political performance, a temporary arrangement. His voice was steady, but she could hear something underneath it. I was not told that someone connected to me through an unfinished bond would feel it. I didn't know that was possible, and no one thought to ask. Or no one chose to. The silence that followed had a specific texture to it. A knock at the door. Arthur crossed the room and opened it, and the woman who came in was someone Sandra had not been expecting. Tall, composed, with the kind of stillness that comes from having rehearsed a difficult thing so many times you've worn the nerves off it. Lorena Voss. She looked at Sandra first. Not at Arthur, not at the floor, not at the window. At Sandra. I asked her to come, Arthur said. I thought you needed to hear it from someone who was there. Lorena sat down in the chair by the door without being invited, which Sandra respected. My father arranged the marking with Turlow, she said. Her voice was clear and direct. I was told it was temporary, a blood seal. I was told Arthur's bond was unresolved and likely incompatible. I didn't know what that meant precisely, and I didn't push, which I should have. A breath. When the seal was performed, I felt nothing. That was how I knew it was a blood seal and not something real. There was warmth and light, and it looked correct, but there was nothing underneath it. No connection, no pull. Sandra looked at her. Lorena met her eyes without flinching. I learned your name 6 months ago. I learned what you felt and where you went about a month after that. She paused. I've known for some time that someone was paying for what my father arranged, and Turlow approved. I came here because you deserve to hear it from me directly. Not from a document. Not from someone else's version of it. Why now? Sandra said. Why not before? Because it took me this long to be willing to say it in front of my father's name, Lorena said simply. There was nothing in her voice that asked for understanding. She was not performing remorse. She was just telling the truth, cleanly, because she had decided it was the right thing to do, and the decision had apparently been made some time ago and was not up for discussion. Sandra had not expected to feel respect for the woman. She filed that away too. Lorena stood. She paused at the door. He wrote to you every month, she said to Sandra. I thought you should know that before anyone else told you. Then she was gone. Sandra sat with the new shape of things. Not the marking. Not Arthur. Turlow. The name that appeared at the closing of every door in those 31 letters. The advisor who had arranged the political solution, who had not thought to mention, or had chosen not to mention, that the woman connected to the king through a half-formed bond would feel a blood seal exactly like a real one. Did he know? Sandra said. Arthur looked at her. Did Turlough know what I would feel? Did he know I would run? A pause that was its own answer. I don't know, Arthur said. But I'm starting to think those are two different questions. Sandra looked at him across the room and thought about the pattern in 31 letters, the closed doors, the gentle redirections, the voice always arriving just as Arthur was about to act differently. I want to find out, she said. Clyde Dermin arrived at the inn the following morning, with a leather satchel under his arm, and the expression of a man who had been waiting a very long time to open it. He was shorter than his brother, and warmer at the edges in the specific way of people who have decided, somewhere along the way, that they are not going to pretend to feel less than they do. He looked at Sandra when Arthur introduced them, held out his hand and said, I'm glad you're alive. I told Arthur that was the most important thing, and he agreed with me, which is the most I've agreed with him in 2 years. Sandra shook his hand. She decided she liked him immediately. He spread documents across the inn table with the focused energy of someone who has been building toward this moment across many months. He did not dramatize it. He let the papers speak. 31 letters, he said, setting them to one side. A separate stack. Sandra recognized Arthur's handwriting. Found in Turlough's private office. Locked drawer. None opened. The room went very still. Sandra had known, in the abstract way you know things that haven't yet become real, that the letters hadn't reached her because someone had stopped them. The 31 letters on the table the night before had told her that. But knowing a thing in the abstract and seeing the physical evidence of it stacked on a table were different experiences entirely. 31 letters. 2.5 yours. Organized by date, neat and orderly, filed by a careful man who thought about the future and did not leave loose ends. She made herself breathe. There's more, Clyde said. He laid out the second set. Financial records. Payments to tracking agencies with specific instruction codes that translated, when you followed them through the account notations, to delay findings and report non-discovery. Not fail to find her. Delay the finding. Allow the search to exhaust itself slowly, to use up resources and time, and, most importantly, Arthur's willingness to keep looking. He didn't want her found, Clyde said, to Arthur, not to Sandra, but he didn't want you to know he didn't want her found. He wanted you to conclude, on your own, after enough time and enough failure, that she had chosen not to be found. And I did, Arthur said quietly. You were supposed to. That was the design. The third document was worse than the first two in the specific way of things that are not explosive, but cold. An internal memo, Turlough's handwriting. Sandra was described in it as an unclassified bond risk and political liability to be managed through natural resolution. Natural resolution. She understood what that meant. He had been waiting for Arthur to give up, for the search to close, for the bond to fade from neglect, for life to move forward in the direction Turlough had already decided was correct. He had decided she was a problem, not a person, a variable that needed to be moved off the board. Arthur had been standing at the window with his back to the room since the second document. He was still there. His shoulders carried the weight of something landing, and he was absorbing it the way she had seen him absorb things before, not deflecting, not reacting outward, taking it in and holding it still while he figured out what to do with it. She had always found that both difficult and honest. You couldn't reach him easily when he did that, but you also always knew he was dealing with the real thing, not the performance of dealing with it. He intercepted them, Arthur said finally, still at the window. Everyone. Everyone, Clyde confirmed, but I thought she was choosing not to answer. I know. The silence in the room was of the kind that asks everyone in it to simply be present in it. So they were. Then Sandra did the thing she hadn't planned to do. She stood up from her chair and walked to the corridor, and Arthur, whether he heard her or felt her through the bond or simply turned at the right moment, followed. They were alone in the narrow hallway of the small inn, morning light coming through a window at the far end, and she looked at him with everything she had decided she needed to say, distilled into the simplest form she could make it. "I'm angry," she said. "I need you to know I'm angry. Not at you. Not right now. Not mostly. But I'm angry that someone else made this decision for both of us, and I walked out of your life on the strength of something he arranged and never corrected. I need somewhere to put that before anything else happens." Arthur looked at her, not with the expression of a man who was about to explain or minimize or redirect, with the expression of someone who understood that this was not a statement requiring a response, just a witness. "I know," he said. "You're allowed to be. Not, I understand. Not, I feel the same way." Just the quiet acknowledgement that her anger had the right to exist exactly where it was. She nodded. One small nod. They stood in the corridor for a moment longer, the bond between them steady and unhurried, and then they both went back inside to help Clyde finish building the case. The great council chamber of Aldenmere was designed to make individuals feel small. High ceilings, cold stone, a long table that had been in use for generations and looked it. The chairs along the walls for witnesses and observers were formal and uncomfortable, which was, Sandra suspected, also intentional. She sat in a chair that was slightly wrong. Someone had carried it in from an adjoining room because the chamber's witness seating was full, and it was a touch too low and set at a slightly awkward angle, and she found, to her surprise, that this made her feel more herself than anything else the palace had offered her so far. She was not a fixture here. She had never been. She was a woman in a Crestlow coat who had come back as a witness on her own terms, and the slight impracticality of her chair confirmed that. Winnie was in the observer gallery. She had insisted on coming in a tone that did not allow for counter-argument, and Sandra had not offered one. Winnie was wearing a hat that she had very clearly bought specifically for the occasion, and was also very clearly not going to admit to having bought for the occasion. Sandra had looked at the hat in the palace courtyard and felt something loosen in her chest, a small, warm thing that had nothing to do with Arthur or Turlough or 31 letters. She was not alone. That was all. She was not alone. Clyde opened the session. He presented the evidence the way he had presented it at the inn, without drama, document by document, building a record so clean and specific that there was no air left in the room for a reasonable counter-argument, date by date, payment by payment, letter by letter. When he reached the memo, the one that called her an unclassified bond risk to be managed through natural resolution, he read it aloud in the same tone he had used for the financial records, which was somehow more devastating than any emphasis would have been. Marmon Turlough was seated 3 chairs from the head of the table. He was a composed man. Sandra had not seen him before this morning. She had only known him through 31 letters, through the pattern of closed doors, through a memo written in his careful handwriting. In person, he was older than she had imagined, silver-haired and upright, with the particular stillness of a man who has occupied power for long enough that his body has learned to wear it like clothing. He let Clyde finish. Then he explained himself. He did it calmly, in a measured voice, as without once raising his tone or looking defensive, An unclassified bond type, he said, carried genuine risk for the Crown's stability. Sandra Mills had no documented standing in the court's records, no family name, no political alliance. His decisions had been made to protect the Crown, as all his decisions had been made across 15 years of service. The information available at the time had supported his conclusions. He would make the same decisions again. It was a very good argument, clear and reasonable, and built on real concerns, the kind of argument that half-truths make better than whole lies do. 3 council members looked briefly persuaded. Then the chamber door opened. Lorena Voss walked in without an announcement. She had not sent word ahead. She simply appeared in the doorway and stood there with the quiet or specific presence of a person who has made a decision that is going to cost them and has decided to stop delaying it. The room changed. She confirmed everything. The false marking, the arrangement between her father, Ralph Voss, and Turlough, the blood seal performed in place of a true bond, the fact that she had felt nothing during the ceremony because there was nothing to feel. She did not read from notes. She spoke from memory, which was either because she had lived with it long enough that the details were permanent, or because she had rehearsed it until they were, and it didn't matter which. She did not look at her father, who was seated 3 chairs to her left, and had gone very pale. Then Healer Doolin, a palace healer who had, it turned out, documented something important 2 years earlier and placed it carefully in the official record, was called to read her notes. Sandra had not known there were notes. She had not known a healer had noticed anything. Healer Doolin was a small woman with tired eyes and the posture of someone who had spent many years doing work that required both precision and compassion, and had found, over time, that the two were not incompatible. She stood at the head of the table and read from a report she had written 26 months earlier. The bond, her notes said, had not faded. The markers on Arthur's end had not dissolved the way they should have if the connection had been severed or abandoned. They had been held at a consistent, controlled tension, as though the other half of the bond was not gone, as though she was present, and had learned to go very quiet inside the connection, as though she was still there, just silent. Sandra sat in her slightly wrong chair and listened to a palace healer read a clinical description of 3 years of breathing shallowly so she couldn't be found, and she was very careful not to let her face change, because she was in a council chamber, and there were people watching, and she would do her feeling later, when she was somewhere private. Turlough was escorted from the chamber between 2 guards. He walked past Sandra's chair on the way out. He did not look at her. She had not expected him to. She was not a person to him. She had been a variable on a document. Variables do not require acknowledgement when they are finally resolved. She watched him go, and then looked back at the chamber, at the council recorder writing, or at Clyde, who had the expression of someone who has successfully done something that needed doing for a very long time. Winnie, from the observer gallery, was weeping openly into a handkerchief. She had brought a handkerchief for this purpose, which meant she had anticipated the weeping, which meant Winnie Doolin knew her better than Sandra sometimes gave her credit for. Lorena paused beside Sandra's chair on her way out. She said only, "He wrote to you every month. I thought you should know that before someone else made it into something different than it was." Then she was gone. Clyde appeared at Sandra's elbow with a cup of water and the straightforward warmth of a man who didn't make things complicated when they didn't need to be. "Welcome back," he said. "I'm sorry it took this long." Sandra looked around the cold, high-ceilinged chamber that had been designed to make individuals feel small, and she thought, "I do not feel small." She felt, for the first time in 3 years, exactly the right size. She asked for 2 weeks. Arthur said whatever you need without a pause, and without asking how much or why. And she went back to Crestlow in the same carriage she had arrived in, with Winnie beside her, wearing the occasion hat that she had now committed to fully, and would not be discussing. The first morning back, Sandra opened the bakery at the usual hour. The flour order had come in correctly this time. The left rack of the oven had been repaired while she was gone. Winnie had arranged it without being asked, which was the most Winnie thing that had ever happened. The cinnamon rolls came out the right colour, while she worked the early shift the way she always had, and the rhythm of it, push, quarter turn, fold, repeat, was the same as it always was, and she was grateful for that. Some rhythms were worth keeping. She did not think about the decision during the shift. She thought about it in the evenings, by the fire, with the 31 letters stacked on the table, not reading them again, just knowing they were there. The physical evidence of 2.5 years of a man talking to the silence. She reread 3 of them, not the first ones, not the last one. The middle ones, where he had been neither formal nor defeated. Just himself on a page, without the weight of a crown on every sentence. Was writing about Clyde and the terrible council sessions, and the specific quality of silence in the records room, and the way he still sometimes reached for a thought that he had been in the habit of sharing with her, and found, when he got there, that there was no one on the other end. Winnie asked her once, only once, what she was going to do. "I don't know yet," Sandra said. Winnie nodded and did not ask again. What Sandra actually thought, in the private hours between closing the bakery and the moment sleep arrived, was this. The girl who had walked out of the palace through the eastern gate 3 years ago had been right to walk. She had had no other information. The evidence in front of her had been clear and specific, and she had trusted it, because trust is not stupidity. It is just trust, and sometimes it gets used against you. But the girl who walked out in the dark had done the correct thing with everything she knew. But Sandra was not that girl anymore. She was a woman who now had a different set of information. 31 letters. A healer's notes describing a bond that had never stopped being alive. A council record that had corrected the official story. The testimony of Lorena Voss delivered without self-interest or apology. And Arthur Dermin, in a road-worn coat, standing in her bakery at pre-dawn without a single member of his court. She thought about what it cost to choose love a second time, the specific courage it required, not the grand version, but the quiet one, the kind you locate in the mornings when the flour order is short, and the left rack is running hot, and you still show up for the early shift because showing up is what you do. She thought about what he had written in letter number 17, in the middle of the stack, in the voice that was not formal and not defeated. There are things I should have said before and didn't. Not because I didn't know them. Because I was better at carrying things than setting them down. I'm trying to get better at setting things down. She had read that one 3 times. On Tuesday, 11 days into the 2 weeks she had asked for, she got dressed in the morning and put on her Crestlow coat, the one she had bought herself after she arrived. Not the palace coat she had left behind. Hers. She told Winnie she was going back. Winnie looked at her for a moment, with the expression of a woman who had known this was coming since approximately the moment Arthur had walked through the bakery door. "I'm coming with you," Winnie said. "I'll need to pack the occasion hat." "I know," Sandra said. "I already figured that in." The palace courtyard was quiet when she arrived. She had not sent word ahead. She had not announced herself. She came on a Tuesday, which was ordinary on purpose, because the ceremony she was here for was going to be small and chosen, and it did not need to be anything else. Arthur was already in the courtyard. He was standing near the gate with the expression of a man who either had extremely good instincts or extremely good bond sensitivity, and she suspected it was both. He looked at her, at the Crestlow coat, at Winnie directly behind her, carrying the occasion hat, at Sandra's face, which she wasn't hiding, and the relief in his expression was the same kind of relief she had seen in the bakery doorway. Raw and unguarded and completely honest. She walked across the courtyard and stopped a few feet from him, and they looked at each other in the early morning light. "You came back," he said. "I came back. Are you sure?" She had been thinking about how to answer that for 11 days. She had considered several versions, careful ones, measured ones, versions that protected her while still being honest. She had discarded all of them. "I'm not sure about very much," she said. "I haven't been for 3 years. But I'm sure about this." He was quiet for a moment. Then he exhaled, slow and careful, and she felt the bond between them ease. Not suddenly, but the way a knot eases when you stop pulling against it. Something releasing. "I want to tell you something," he said, before any ceremony, just to have said it. She waited. "I should have said more, or in those 2 years at the palace. I was better at carrying things than setting them down, and I carried what I felt about you in a way that was private when it should have been shared. I told myself I was being careful. I think I was being afraid." He paused. "I'm trying to set things down now." She recognized the language. Letter 17. "I know," she said. "I read the letters." Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically, just the small change of a man whose long and patient effort has arrived somewhere real. "All 31? All 31? He nodded. That was enough. Healer Doolin officiated. Sandra had asked for her specifically, and the healer had accepted in the matter-of-fact way of a woman who has documented a bond for 2.5 years and considers its completion something of a professional satisfaction. She stood in the small room with a calm competence that Sandra found genuinely comforting. Clyde was there. He had apparently also anticipated this Tuesday, because he arrived dressed appropriately and was in a mood so openly pleased that he did not even try to manage it. Winnie was there with the occasion hat fully deployed, seated in the corner chair that someone had thoughtfully carried in for her. There was no court, no council, no observers from the political side of anything. Just this room, these people, and the bond that had spent 3 years going quietly in order to survive. Sandra stood beside Arthur and looked at him, and he looked at her. Healer Doolin spoke clearly and without unnecessary ceremony. She explained for the record what was being done and what had been done before, and why the two were different. She had the notes. She always had the notes. Then she nodded to them. Sandra breathed in. The bond had been quiet for 3 years. Not absent. She knew that now, had always known it in the place that knew things before the mind did. But quiet. Held. Suppressed to a low hum she could almost convince herself was just the sound of her own heartbeat. She stopped suppressing it. The warmth was immediate and enormous, and absolutely nothing like the cold, tearing sensation she had felt 3 years ago through a blood seal. This was not performed. It was not political. It had nothing to do with anything that could be arranged. It was just the two of them. The bond opening from both sides at once, after 3 years of being held at half, spreading into all the space that had been waiting. She exhaled. Arthur closed his eyes for just a moment. When he opened them, something was settled there that she had never seen settled before. Some long-held tension, present in every interaction across 2 years of stolen evenings that she had not known to name at the time, and could only now recognize by its absence. He pressed his forehead to hers. Neither of them said anything for a long time. The bond carried everything that words would only diminish. She could feel it. Not dramatically, not like a story told in gestures, but quietly. The warmth of it, the steadiness, the specific feeling of something that had been going quietly for 3 years, finally allowed to be the size it actually was. She felt it settle into her chest. Not a chain, not a wound, not even, really, a choice anymore. It had been a choice, and she had made it. And now it was something else, and something that simply was. Like breath, like warmth, like the rhythm of pushing dough against a wooden counter in the dark before the town woke up. She thought, I came back to myself, and then I came back here. Both things were true at the same time. An hour later, the palace garden was occupied in the specific, informal way of people who have done something significant and are now waiting for the feeling to finish settling. Clyde had found Winnie almost immediately and was listening to a story she was telling with evident full attention and the expression of a man who had decided this woman was excellent, and that was that. Winnie was making emphatic hand gestures that suggested the story involved either the occasion hat or the tracking of the carriage route, and possibly both. Hela Doolin had located a garden chair and a cup of tea, and the settled expression of a woman who had done her job correctly and was now taking a well-earned moment to enjoy the fact. Sandra and Arthur sat on the stone steps at the edge of the garden, not elaborately, not dramatically, just shoulder to shoulder, her head tipped slightly toward his, watching the small, strange collection of people who had come together around this particular Tuesday. The bond hummed between them, warm, unhurried, asking nothing. "What do you want?" Arthur asked quietly, "now that you don't have to want carefully." She had not thought about that question. She had been so focused on the architecture of the decision itself, whether to come back, how to come back, on whose terms, that the open territory on the far side of it was still new. As she thought about it, she thought about the flour delivery coming in correct, the left rack finally running straight, the cinnamon rolls in the right color, Winnie's handkerchief at the council session, the 31 letters stacked on a table in the room above the bakery. She thought about what it meant to have built a life that was hers from nothing, piece by piece, and not want to give that back, even for this. "I want the bakery," she said, "and I want this. Both things. At the same time." Arthur looked at her. A quiet look, the specific one she had stored away 100 times, the one he used when he was holding something carefully. "Then you'll have both," he said. Simply. The way he said things that he had already decided were true and didn't need elaboration. She believed him. That was the remarkable thing. Not the ceremony. Was not the bond settling into place. Not even the 31 letters or Lorena Voss or Clyde spreading documents across an inn table in Crestlow. The remarkable thing was that. She believed him. She had spent 3 years learning to be careful with belief, treating it like something expensive to be rationed, learning not to spend it on things she couldn't afford to lose. And it had kept her alive and intact and capable of being here for this Tuesday. But 3 years and 31 letters and one small honest man in a road-worn coat had built something that was different from hope, which could still be taken away. This was quieter than hope, steadier, the kind of thing you could breathe normally inside. Across the garden, Winnie had finished her story. Clyde was laughing, the open, the full-throated kind, and Winnie looked pleased with herself in the restrained way of people who know exactly how good they are at things and don't need to announce it. Hela Doolin refilled her tea. The palace garden was warm in the morning sun, and the bond was warm in Sandra's chest, and the day was entirely ordinary, which was exactly right. She had chosen this, clearly, consciously, on her own feet, in her own coat, on a Tuesday. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything she had not let herself want carefully. And now, at last, she did not have to.
Who is that? I think it's her.